Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, February 4th, 2025, and our friend John Helmer is back with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me, Nima.
Let's get started, John, with the comprehensive deal agreement between Iran and Russia. What does that mean, in your opinion, for the relationship between the two countries?
Well, what if we start this way? Because there's a 200-year history of Russian relations with Iran, of war between the two states, or originally the two empires, the Russian Empire and the Iranian Empire. And over these 200 years, there have been very grave strategic mistakes of understanding and misjudgment the Iranians have had of the Russian side, and the Russians have had on the of the Iranian side. So I think what we have a chance to do for our viewers and listeners is to shine a new kind of light from the Moscow perspective and from the Iranian perspective on this 200-year history. This is a very long time. And we have to understand that what I've been calling the Pistachio Pact, but the agreement that was reached and signed between the presidents of Iran and Russia, as you said, in January, puts it in context. And so, if I might, I would say this: over these 200 years, there have been two big themes on the Russian side in the Griboyedov line and the Yermolov line. Griboyedov line refers to Alexander Griboyedov, a young diplomat who was murdered in Tehran by a mob in January 1829. And that murder occurred during a process of exacting over the Shah of Iran at the time, a weak Shah who had lost several major battles and war with Russia, and had lost what was the Iranian Empire's position in Georgia, Azerbaijan, and ultimately what we now know as Yerevan and Armenia. The killing of Griboyedov followed his attempt, first on the one hand to soften the concessions enforced on Iran, which included major compensation payments and major loss of territories and the occupation of northern Iran by Russian forces. He was murdered during a period in which various kinds of humiliation were inflicted by the Russian side, by the victorious Russian side, on the Iranians and on the Shah. And a mob attacked the Russian embassy, killed almost everybody, all but one, including Griboyedov. But Griboyedov represented a kind of diplomatic cooperation. And we'll come back to the word cooperation because it's repeated dozens of times in the pact that was signed in January. The Yermolov line is the military line at the time, and that was a combination of effective Russian force defeating Iran, as I said, taking Georgia and Azerbaijan. And it represented, in Yermolov's case, racism. It was a very anti-Muslim attitude, and it was humiliating, intentionally humiliating for the Iranians of the time. Now we'll see different Russian officials and different Russian trends over these 200 years, reflecting the kind of, let's call it, cooperative diplomatic line, and the, let's call it the Griboyedov line, and the heavy military line. Although, as it were, these days, and certainly the last half dozen years, the Russian military line towards Iran has been considerably more cooperative than one has seen from the Kremlin. That's a major theme of difference between the two states. Second major theme that we can see operating in this latest pact is the suspicion of a third party. Russia has long had the suspicion, certainly since Stalin's occupation of northern Iran in 1945, that Iran and the Shah represented a combination of, behind the Shah, Anglo-American interests. We're jumping ahead of the Gribouillev time, 1828, 1829, to Stalin's time, where the Russian side believed a weak Iran represented an opportunity for engagement on the edges of the Russian Federation, the Russian Empire, then the Russian Soviet Union, and then the Russian Federation, of Anglo-American, particularly American interest in oil and gas, British interest in oil and in territory, and in threatening Russian positions in the Caucasus. The suspicion on the Russian side was of a weak Iran influenced against Russia by outsiders, particularly the Americans and the British. On the Iranian side, what we see today and what has been characteristic of relations for the last 25 years, certainly since the Khomeini revolution in Iran since 1979, is the suspicion that Russia has a particularly secret and negative, from an Iranian point of view, relationship with a third party of Israel. And this raises a very important question that has preoccupied, for example, the last two presidents, certainly President Raisi, that President Putin encourages Israeli expansion, and in so doing encourages a combination of US and Israeli attacks on Iran. So the Iranian perception of Russian policy has been that President Putin has a special relationship with Israel and has created existential threat to Iranian security, existential in the same threatening and grand strategic fashion that Russia believes the United States and NATO have in the Ukraine war against Russia. So each side has the belief and the suspicion of the other side as participating in this type of third-party threat. And then there's the third issue, which is regrettable, but real. And that is the perception of each side that there is racism towards the other. And maybe we'll come back to that in a little while, if you don't mind. What's extraordinary about the more recent modern history, modern part of this 200-year history, is that about every 10 years, the leadership in Moscow has attempted to negotiate a Gribouillev accommodation. We know that, for example, Stalin at one point in 45, 46 was seeking to pressure the Shah to accept an expansion of Russian, Soviet, and Azeri power in the north of Iran, including Tabriz. At one point, Stalin in 45, 46 encouraged an Azeri takeover and threat to the Shah. Subsequently, under US pressure and British pressure, and in exchange for various territorial post-German war settlement, Stalin withdrew forces and changed his line. But essentially, what Stalin tried to do was to damage the Shah and replace the Iranian Shah's regime with a republican regime, and that failed. Subsequently, we know the British and Americans pulled a coup against the Mossadegh prime ministry in 53 and increased their involvement in anti-Soviet policy through the Shah through the 1950s and 60s until the Shah was overthrown. Now, the following Stalin's version of cooperation, military pressure, cooperation, diplomatic alignment versus military pressure, Khrushchev tried to reach a non-aggression mutual security pact with Iran in the 1960s, and Brezhnev repeated that 10 years later to no avail. The Shah remained in the Anglo-American camp. And that's not new, but for most listeners, this process of Russian attempt or Moscow attempt, Soviet and Russian attempt to accommodate Iran and reduce the extent to which Iran threatened Russia with the assistance of England, of the British and the Americans. These attempts were repeatedly made almost every 10 years. And then we come to 1975, when the KGB chief in Tehran, Leonid Shebashin, backed in Moscow, of course, by the KGB, but by the very significant figure of Yevgeny Primakov, understood that the Shah did not have long to survive. And it was Soviet policy to encourage the Tudeh party and secular left forces in Iran to bring down the Shah. At the same time, by 1977-78, we know that the Carter administration, particularly the president, Jimmy Carter, and his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, were determined to reinforce the Shah and increase the pressure on the Soviet Union at that time, particularly in Afghanistan. So we are seeing from 1975 to 1979 and the Khomeini revolution, the active effort of the US on one side and the Soviet Union on the other to make war on each other through Iran. This results in the dramatic November 79 hostage taking, in which the US embassy is occupied and hostages held for almost 2 years until the Reagan administration came in. During that time, we also remember Brzezinski and Carter launched a military attempt invading Iran to rescue the hostages. There are all sorts of accounts of what happened. I remember in those days I was on the civilian side of the White House, but it was possible to obtain 20, 25 volumes of the papers that were seized by the students in the US Embassy, reassembled from the shredder and published as evidence of years and years of plotting by the US, and you can read all about it in these volumes, against the Soviet Union through the Shah, support of Israel through the Shah, and so on. What we come to in, let's say, the term of office since President Putin came to power is the same combination of underlying suspicion, same combination of military and diplomatic differences, and a similar combination of attempts to reach non-aggression, mutual security, non-threatening relations, and cooperative relations between Iran, now under clerical rule and no longer Shah, and in which Russia is recovering from a period of US domination through the Yeltsin period. And so we come finally to the Pact of January, in which the word cooperation appears several dozen times. Pardon me for not remembering everything I've written, but listeners will find, or viewers will find, detailed analysis in the Dances with Bears website and in several pieces. What I can say is that this was a pact that did not represent a Russian commitment to defend Iran, an explicit commitment to defend Iran from Israeli attack, but that was the underlying suspicion that Iran was attempting to resolve, because Iran has, and President Raisi made President Putin extremely and visibly uncomfortable when pointing out that Putin had a particularly sympathetic relationship with Israel and its leaders, and particularly Netanyahu. So the pact represents something short of what Iran was seeking. It maximized all of the areas of trade, Caspian Sea, concessions, transportation, trade, and so forth, which both sides have been attempting to develop and to some extent have developed for many years. But you didn't need this new treaty. Between this Treaty of January or agreement, strategic agreement of 2025, and the Declaration on Strategic Partnership, which the Putin administration signed in 2001, that's 24 years, there have been considerable efforts made on the trade or the Griboyedov side, the diplomatic side, to reduce tensions, reduce strain, reduce suspicion between the two countries, and protect each of them from third parties. However, the problem has been for Iran, Israel. And behind Israel, the perception of Iran, and it's not mistaken, the US attempt to allow an expansionist Israel to threaten to destroy all of the neighboring Arab states and then Iran. And from a Russian point of view, that level of strategic change had to be resisted. But the Iranians have suspected that President Putin was far more accommodating of those Israeli goals. And they needed the pact to mitigate and reduce their suspicion on that ground. That's a 200-year history, and those who understand the history, including you're Iranian, you can tell me yourself what degree of suspicion of Russian intentions Iranians like you and your colleagues continue to have. This was a pact to reduce Iranian suspicion on the one hand and Russian suspicion on the other. And it's to that extent admirable, but it doesn't resolve the underlying issues.
We know that, John, we know that Russia under Vladimir Putin is totally different from Russia what it was before. And Iran has tremendous change from in the aftermath of the revolution in Iran. These are huge changes that has happened to these two countries. That's why we are witnessing Russia and Russia and Iran in a new sort of communication, new sort of partnership, if we can call it. But how far they can go, in your opinion, how strategic one is for another, how important Russia is for Iran or Iran is for Russia. Is that the same? Is that the same sort of a strategic manner? Or when you look at Russia from Iranian perspective or look at Iran from Russian perspective, it's totally different?
Yes. Well, it's a very big question, and we're trying to combine the two different perspectives. As I've said, each side is suspicious of the other side threatening its borders, its national security, its economy. Each side. And this is not discussed inside Russia publicly. What's not discussed publicly is the extent to which President Putin has supported Israel in its expansion. And on the other hand, the Iranian side has, from a Russian point of view, complicated what Russia wants to achieve as good relations, productive relations with the oil sheikdoms, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, and so forth, on the western side of the Persian Gulf. What Russia has tried to do, and it has tried to reduce tension, reduce suspicion with what the foreign ministry came up with. And I'm having to look at notes because we are talking about extremely complicated maneuvers on the military side, on the intelligence agency side, and on the diplomatic side. What we know preceding last month's Pact was that the Russian side has come up with a framework for mutual security and non-aggression in the region, but including non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. However, everybody knows that will never be signed on to by Israel. Israel threatens the entire region with nuclear annihilation, nuclear attack, and is backed by the United States and NATO to do that. In response, Iran has had to develop its own nuclear capacities, and that in turn has triggered the very elaborate system of negotiation between the United States, Iran, Russia, and other powers to mitigate the Iranian nuclear threat. But there is no such negotiation possible with the Israelis, who've maintained and expanded their nuclear threat capacity. In response, the Iranians have demonstrated the capacity for missile development, hypersonic missile development, which could threaten the relatively small, territorially small Israeli state with non-nuclear destruction. This has only been demonstrated. It's not being applied. I'm not sure if I'm wandering away from your question, but the problem of mutual suspicion, the problem of Israel, and the problem that Russia has supported Israel remains a central stumbling block. It was between President Putin and President Raisi. And after the death of President Raisi and the question of why he died and whether he was murdered, and if he was murdered, who did it? These are issues that I've written about and I tried to analyze as best I could, but there's neither a discussion of that disaster for Iran in Iran, nor is there in Russia. So what we have is, let's call it the Lavrov or Foreign Ministry proposal for mutual security and non-proliferation and non-aggression in the Middle East, including Iran and the Arab states, but excluding Israel as a way of building an alliance that would be strong enough, Arab and Iranian, to prevent Israeli expansion and US-driven Israeli expansion. That would benefit Russia from the possibility of a return of Iran to the Shah's time, when Iran threatened Russia's positions in the Caucasus. And we go back to Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Caspian Sea. This was the conflict zone in which the story I've just begun with, the Griboyev-Yermolov story, began in the 1820s, when Iran and Russia were at war with one another. So Iran is crucial to Russia's southern defense, and we see the respect for Iran and the encouragement of Iran at the same time as from President Putin, at the same time as the Russian side must try to increase its support for Azerbaijan, balance its support for Azerbaijan with its traditional support for Armenia. And we've seen the US attempting to use Georgia to attack Russia, which happened and was defeated. We see the US encouraging Armenia to go the same direction. We're back in 1828. And we are back so seriously that Russia and Iran share major issues in common. They are the two most sanctioned states in the world at the moment. And they have a common interest in defeating US economic warfare, not just US economic warfare, NATO economic warfare. One. Two, they have a common interest in defending their right to survive, their existential sovereignty and culture from American Israeli expansion. Except that President Putin defends Israel in ways in which we've seen involve the murder of Iranian officers and diplomats in Beirut and in Damascus. We've seen the attack on the Hamas leader Haniyeh in Iran. We've seen a level of violence against Iranians and Arabs by Israel and the United States, which in practice, it's the Russian military objective to stop or deter, but which in practice politically, President Putin has not acted in the same way. Instead, uses the word restraint. Both sides should use restraint. Well, this expression restraint, when used in Moscow, was used when the US and Israel and the NATO powers went to war to kill Gaddafi, the leader of Libya, and destroy Libya as a secular, independent national force against Israel and against the United States, and succeeded. Restraint at that time, the president at that time was President Medvedev, cost Libya its status and cost Gaddafi his life. And we've seen another episode of that in the destruction of Bashar al-Assad in Syria in the past 2 months. So when Russia says both sides should exercise restraint, when the other side is expanding murderously and effectively destroying both Arab and Iranian positions, then Russia's threatened in the south, and it needs Iran more, but it can't because of this duality of position towards Israel and the United States.
And why is that? Why the Putin administration is so cautious about Israel?
I wouldn't use the word cautious. I would say President Putin is supportive of Israel. And there have been many attempts inside Russia and outside Russia to explain why he is personally so positive in ways in which uh, his colleagues, military, intelligence, and diplomatic, are not. Um, this is a very sensitive topic, and it's one of the reasons why it's not discussed. And President Putin has himself not discussed it. I've seen, and listeners and viewers will have seen, attempts to explain how closely President Putin has identified with a Jewish school teacher who moved to Israel, has and his origins in Leningrad that brought him in close contact with and enjoyed the support of Jewish people at that time. He himself, President Putin himself, has talked about this and has tried to represent himself as a model of, let's say, opposition to any form of anti-Semitism in Soviet and Russian policy. That's admirable. He has been extremely reluctant to call what Israel has done in Palestine, in Gaza, genocide. Why? Nobody has asked him why he is so reluctant to call what has happened in Gaza genocide. Russia recognizes that Germans attempted genocide against Russians during World War II. Russia has accepted that the Turks attempted genocide against the Armenians between 1915, let's say, and 1925. Why the reluctance to recognize Israel's genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza? That's a question to ask President Putin, and he has repeatedly refused to answer it. There is one occasion in which I reported. Go to the website, go to the search box and put genocide in it. And one occasion on which President Putin has referred to the violence in Gaza almost as Israeli genocide in the way the international court and international public opinion, and certainly Russian public opinion, recognizes it to be. But that's a question for President Putin, and maybe this isn't the right place for me to discuss why I think President Putin has a particularly close, personal, sentimental relationship with Israel. What I can say, because we're focusing on the Iranian and Arab relationship, is that I believe President Raisi made President Putin extremely uncomfortable by raising this issue when in their last, Raisi's last visit to Moscow. And the current president of Iran did not.
Yeah. When we look at the nature of the relationship between Russia and Israel, they cannot be that close because of the connection between Israel and the United States. We know that at the end of the day, the United States doesn't want Russia to be strong. And they did
That's
everything against
that,
Russia.
that's putting it very mildly. Yes.
Yeah. And on the other hand, it seems that Russia has some sort of concerns about the extremism, Wahhabism, and other these
Yeah.
ISIS and Al Qaeda, all of these factions, which, in my opinion, would bring Russia, Iran, and even Israel to the same camp. They are all concerned about. When you look at Syria, what has happened in Syria, What we learned from the mainstream media, they're talking about that Israel was so happy because Iran and Russia are defeated in Syria. But we know that Israel has its own concerns about what has happened in Syria, and what has happened in Syria that could be much more complicated. That would be what we've been witnessing so far. Do you think that after all, with all that said, Israel connection with the United States, which would put Russia would in a position that they have to be more cautious about Israel. On the other hand, you see an Iranian government which is totally disconnected with the West, mostly disconnected with the West. They seek some sort of partnership with the East, with Russia, China, since the
Yes,
United States is not willing to participate or to negotiate with them. And with the Wahhabism, with the Daesh, Al Qaeda, all these factions, extremists in that region would bring Russia and Iran together. They have no other option but working with each other, cooperating.
yes,
How would that come to the equation on the part of Iranians and Russians? Are they because of that? Because they knew, you look at Russia today, even today in the European Union, they're talking about breaking Russia into federations, into they're talking about Chechnya, Dagestan, they're not part of Russia. These are huge concerns on the part of Russians.
yes.
And here comes the role of Iran in managing this situation, in not letting these people get in power in that region. How do you see all the picture is so complex. The picture is so difficult to understand. But at the end of the day, there has to be some sort of understanding on the part of the Iranian government and the Russian government, knowing all the reality of the
Yes.
complexity of the issue, but after all, working with each other.
Well, the first point is the most valuable one you're making, Nima, and that is how complex Arab and Iranian politics are. Now, regrettably, and I have to say it because it affects the interpretation each side has of each other, I have to talk briefly about Russian racism. You've had on your program a Russian named Dmitry Orlov, who's in fact a US citizen who moved with his parents to the United States when he was a child in the 1970s as part of the Jackson Vanik immigration from Russia. And on your program, he has referred to the Arabs as psychotics. He has referred to them as 6th century people unable to fight, and various other very unpleasant expressions that involve anti-Islam and anti-Arab sentiment of a race type. Now that racism is unacceptable in Russia itself. And President Putin has had, as you said, to juggle a number of powerful constituencies inside the country to preserve the federation, especially the Muslim republics of the Caucasus. And you mentioned two of them. There are more. And the role in which the US has played to stimulate Muslim-based terrorism inside Russia, first in the Chechen wars and then more recently, is a fundamental issue in which the leadership of Russia rejects racism, whether it's against Jews or against Muslims, against Arabs or against Iranians. To hear people who support Russia in its war to defend itself from the US on the Ukrainian battlefield attack Arabs, blame Arabs for primitivism, psychological I mean, why beat this bush? It's been beaten enough in the explanation of why Assad fell and why Russia did the right thing letting him go. I don't want to, unless you ask me, explain more about it, but it's a fundamentally racist view that is abhorrent, should be abhorrent to all of us, and is to the president of Russia and is to Russian policy. However, as you say, Arab politics, Iranian politics, Caucasian politics have always been complex and required great skill in understanding family and kin relationships, tribal relationships, clan relationships, regional relationships, and underlying all of these, the economics, commerce, culture, language, and religious links that make these things political forces. Russia's had more than 200 years of dealing with these things, and we don't want to simplify what's going on in the fashion that the Western press and some Russian press and some pro-Russian media abroad want to simplify things. Yes, Russia must defend itself from attempts to break it up, break the federation up in the Caucasus, and that has meant significant cooperation with Iran and Turkey and the Arab states, including Syria, against the, let's call them the terror factions, which began, Al-Qaeda began with the support of President Carter and Brzezinski as an anti-Soviet, anti-Russian weapon. So there is this natural alliance against that kind of terrorism, which is an existential threat to Russia from the south. And so that involves not just Iran, as I said, but also Turkey. Second, the skill with which the Israelis and the Americans and British manipulate these factions requires countermeasures of the Iranian, Russian, Turkish, and Arab sides. And these produce temporary tactical alliances, temporary, it produces a plethora of combinations that aren't easy in a single few minutes that we have together to explain. Are they temporary? Are they permanent? What underlying forces are at work here? If we can stick for our time on the existential threat to Iran, the existential threat to the Arabs of Israel, and the existential threat to Russia, we come back to the question, can Russia balance its special relationship with Israel with its underlying existential defense requirement? The military and intelligence services and the foreign ministry have all been far more committed to countering Israel than the president. And that isn't discussed as a policy option in Russia today. It's defended in the wrong, racist, abhorrent ways abroad, not inside Russia, abroad. That shouldn't happen. And I want to simply say, you won't hear it from me, and I'm sure we won't hear it from you or your guests. However, racism is a force. It's been a force to humiliate and destroy the Arabs, and it's been effective. The book I wrote, The Jackal's Wedding, is a story of the US campaign since 1943, since the invasion of Morocco in 43, to destroy all secular nationalist Arab movements and leaderships. And with the death of Gaddafi in Syria, in Libya, and then the fall of Assad, There are almost none left. And that book ends very sadly on the destruction of the Arabs, but not their fault because they're primitive people or tribal people or psychotic people. This is nonsense. The Soviet and Russian view has been to protect its national interests with alliances within the Arab and Iranian world. And I'm beginning to repeat myself. So why don't I let you ask the questions again? Because we haven't the time to go into each complex situation in each of these states or countries. But that's what one has to do in order to understand the Russian position. As it's evolving, we can see it already moving into Libya. We can see it moving southwards from Libya in Mali and in the Sahel, the African countries bordering the Maghreb, the Arab part of the African continent as it meets the Mediterranean Sea. In each place, these relationships are exceedingly complicated, and Russia has made a number of serious mistakes in that region. I'm talking about the Yevgeny Prigozhin Wagner mistakes, which the Russian military are attempting to resolve at the moment. But that's attached to the Syrian problem because we see Russia moving from Tartus, the naval base, and Khmeimim, the Syrian Air Force base, towards Libya. And we can see and anticipate an Anglo-American war against the Russians in Libya and the Russians in Africa as well. What's Iran's role in all of this? What's the Turkish role in all of this? We have to take them case by case, country by country, episode by episode at a time. I don't want to simplify it, and neither do you.
John, from what we've seen so far in Syria, in your opinion, who's winning in Syria?
Winning, what can I say, Nima? Look, after I left the Carter administration, I spent some time in the Arab League in the office of the Secretary General, who was then Chadli Kalibi, a Tunisian, who headed the Arab League for the time in which the Arab League did not recognize President Sadat of Egypt or the Carter administration's deal with Sadat. That changed. During that time, I came to be involved in Arab politics very directly. And some of that story I've told in the book, The Jackal's Wedding. To say who's winning at a particular moment of time is a photographic snapshot of individuals in action. It's easier to say for the time being that the three states that fueled the offensive, from which Russia withdrew long in advance of the beginning of the November attacks out of Idlib. Russia knew what was happening and had decided not to contain it and not to oppose it. What we can say is the Turks have obtained a degree of control politically, territorially, economically of the coastline of Syria, which it lost after World War I. Turkey is approaching an Ottoman Empire level of control over Syria. We say, therefore, the Turks are winning. Never mind the Syrian or the Arab units through which they act. We would have to say Israel has an unprecedented victory, moving off the Golan Heights, down the slopes towards Damascus, and establishing not a buffer zone, a very large slice of southern Syria to the Damascus suburbs, giving Israel the opportunity to threaten Damascus and any regime that establishes itself in Damascus militarily to a degree that Israel has never had before. So Israel's winning. The United States, which had trained some of these Arab factions and non-Arab factions in Al-Tanf, in the southeast corner of Syria, has established the capacity to deter, as it did in these the November-December days, to deter Iraq or Iran from coming from the northeast of Syria to rescue its allies, the Assad regime in Damascus. The United States preserves its control from Al-Tanf up to the northeast border with Iraq in such a way as to preserve its control over Syrian oil. So one would have to say the Americans have won. What's left of Syria after a tripartite victory of this kind? The south to Israel, the west and the coastline to Turkey, and the east, including the oil, to the United States. What's left for a Syrian Arab victory? I'd say nothing is left except people representing a new Syria replacing the Bashar al-Assad regime, but entirely dependent on one of those three forces, but mostly Turkey. I'd say that means Iran has lost and Russia has lost. Now, we've referred in passing to those who've defended what happened as a strategic adjustment on the part of Russia that doesn't amount to defeat. Well, that's not the understanding in Algeria. It's not the understanding in Libya. It's not the understanding in Egypt of what Russia has achieved in Syria. The pervasive Arab understanding is that Russia had commitments and it dropped them for its reasons. And this is a domino effect of what the perception of Russia in Syria of giving up Assad. And I wrote a piece based on Assad's press secretary, Professor Sakr, who has given a very extensive account of the last days in which Assad was in Moscow trying to negotiate a military rescue that would have involved Putin, Russian air and missile defense of Iranian rescue. And it all failed. It was all rejected. And that account is a credible one. Everyone in the Arab world has read that account. It was broadcast by the Saudis with the intention that everyone in the Arab world would understand it. What's the message? The Arab message? Russia cannot be relied on to meet its commitments. This is a very, very serious judgment, and arguably it may be wrong. We will see. And so the answer to your question is dynamic. Who's winning? Who's losing? Well, it's up to the Russian side now to demonstrate that that judgment is wrong. At the same time, the Russian side has to demonstrate, President Pezeshkian and other senior Iranian officials, both military and civilian and clerical, that Russian commitments can be relied on. Military, political, economic. Who's winning in that situation? Time will tell. And it would be foolish for us to say right now, Russia's losing the effort to recoup, recover its reputation with the Iranians and the Arab states. We will now see this fight transferred, active fight, to Libya. And we've seen in the last few days the Algerians, the bordering Libya, signing new memorandum of understanding with the U.S. Army's African Command. And what we see is the beginnings of a realignment that may not go very far in Algeria. And my French sources on Algeria want to tell me and want to advise me, and I'll write this down so that if people want to look at the detail, they'll be able to see it on the website that incorporates our broadcast today. That there's lots of realignment in the Arab world, and for Algeria to shift towards the United States as it appears to be doing now is a major realignment. But on the other hand, Algeria is run by aging individuals frightened of being toppled by popular forces, and it remains to be seen how far the memorandum of understanding with the US Africa Command is a paper document that doesn't represent a win for the United States and doesn't represent a loss for Russia in Algeria. But what we see is a process of contestation that we've just seen ended in Syria, and we will now see heating up across the Maghreb, Algeria and Tunisia and Libya in particular. And we haven't yet seen exactly what Egypt will do, what President al-Sisi will do. So taking your lead, these are very complex, state-specific situations. It's a bit soon to say Russia's losing right across the region. I wouldn't say that now.
The decision of leaving Syria and letting these people capturing the government on the part of Iranians and Russians, why did they decide to be on the defeated side, on the side that, because they have been investing, not supporting Assad for many years?
Yes.
Do you think that decision on the part of Russians was just an internal decision, or they made that decision together with Iranians because the situation was getting to a point that was not anymore manageable for the two countries, Iran and Russia? That's why they have decided to leave Syria.
It's a good question, Nina, and you've read, I've read Iranian accounts, especially from the IRGC, blaming Russia for having let the Iranian plan of rescuing its position and Assad's position down. That too is, I've reported in the last few weeks, broadcast in Tehran as a position of criticizing, Iranian position criticizing Russia for betraying its commitments to both Iran and Assad, and letting the Turkish-led invasion from the north out of Idlib succeed. So there's that view. There is the pro-Russian view expressed mostly by American bloggers that Russia had to focus its priority on fighting the Ukraine war, where, after all, they point out correctly that Russia is fighting half the world. That's all of NATO and the United States are fighting on that battlefield to destroy Russia through Ukraine. And Russia could not afford either the casualties, the costs or the logistic difficulty of an escalation in Syria to combat the Turks. That's a view, essentially saying Putin did the right thing in limiting the number of wars he could fight at the same time, and to have deterred. The question would arise: that wasn't an instant decision. It's not Assad's corruption, the failure of the Syrian troops who've thrown away their weapons. Syria has been under sanctions even more severe than Russia and Iran has been under, and the poverty inflicted on Russia over these many years, the failure of the alternative Iranian-Russian occupations, let's say, or support systems for building an alternative economy which could feed Syria and pay for Syria. All of these failures have been going on a long time, and there's no question in my mind, on the basis of the evidence, that Russian military intelligence could see the Turkish operation coming for weeks, if not months. So there was an argument between the general staff, the GRU military intelligence, the SVR foreign intelligence, and the Kremlin, principally President Putin, through the Security Council, what to do. Do we deter the Turks? But we need the Turks for our purposes more than we need to fight the Turks if they break out of Idlib and head south. The idea of sacrificing Syria for the greater Russian good in the Ukraine carries a lot of conviction, and that argument intensified as the intelligence of Turkish preparation for the breakout of Idlib became more and more obvious. The problem that I'd focus on, and I have tried to explain it, is that President Putin makes mistakes of anticipation in thinking carefully about balancing constituencies that have different views about what Russian policy should be. So in balancing between those who argued, let's escalate the war with the Ukraine and win decisively against the Americans and NATO there, and sacrifice Syria to that bigger Russian goal. That argument had to be balanced with the argument that if Russia abandons Assad, the entire Arab and Iranian world will conclude that Russia doesn't honor its commitments, and that will weaken the positions that Russian diplomacy, the Griboyev line and the Yermolov military line, have spent years, the last 25 years of President Putin's term, building up and consolidating. The anticipation of a series of dominoes that lose confidence in Russia, that argument did not carry the day when the breakout of Idlib began on November the 29th last year. So that was the argument. Then the defense or the justification of what the results are goes on in writing, in broadcasting, in the media to some extent, and especially outside of Russia. That argument continues. Did Russia do the right thing for Russian interests? Or was there a mistake of anticipation that Russian interests guarding the southern borders of Russia have been damaged, not defeated, damaged, and that has to be repaired quickly, while Russia also fights the war on its western front.
I think this talk can continue for hours, but we have some sort of limitation. John, thank you so much for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
These are serious and not pleasant topics. We are saying them for the first time in public to a Russian audience and an American audience. And I hope that those who doubt what I've been trying to say will do the long read, will look for the evidence. And I hope that this attempt to shine a torch on a 200-year history that we are still in the middle of will help everyone come to a better understanding and a more balanced understanding without racism.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John. See you
Thank you.
soon. Bye bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.